Tom Cruise stepped into the luxurious glass-walled showroom, his sneakers tapping lightly against the gleaming marble floor. The place smelled of fresh leather and expensive cologne, with towering posters of high-end sports cars glistening under golden spotlights. He wasn't here for a photo shoot. He wasn't on a movie set. Today, he was just a man in a worn-out hoodie and faded jeans, looking at cars. His fingers traced the polished surface of a midnight blue Lamborghini, its engine purring faintly in the background. For a moment, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He had driven countless luxury cars in movies, chased down villains, leaped across rooftops, even hung off helicopters. But today, no cameras, no scripts, no special effects. Just him and reality. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Tom turned. A tall, suited man with slicked back hair and a Rolex on his wrist stood in front of him, arms crossed. "Graham Peterson, the dealership manager. Can I help you with something?" The manager's gaze swept over Tom's hoodie and jeans, a smirk twitching at his lips. Tom could already see where this was going. It was the same look he had seen 1,000 times before. Judgment. He had been underestimated before. When he was a young actor auditioning for roles. When he was told he was too short to be an action star. When people assumed he was just another nobody. But today, it was happening all over again. Tom kept his voice light. "Yeah, I'm thinking of getting something new." Graham snorted. "New?" His eyes flicked to Tom's scuffed sneakers, then back up to his face. "I see." Tom knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It was condescension. The manager's smirk deepened as he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Look, buddy. These cars aren't just for anyone who walks in off the street." Tom raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Oh, and who are they for?" "The kind of people who don't wear hoodies from a clearance bin," Graham said, chuckling under his breath. Tom's fingers drummed lightly against the Lamborghini's sleek body. He had dealt with worse. Directors who didn't believe in him. Critics who wrote him off. Industry giants who said he'd never make it big. But today? Today was just a car dealership. Or so he thought. Just as Tom was about to step away, Graham suddenly grabbed his hoodie and shoved him back. Hard. Tom staggered, catching himself just in time before his back hit the car. A few nearby salesmen froze, eyes widening. Graham stepped forward, voice dripping with mockery. "I said get out. You don't belong here." And then a fist. Graham's punch landed right in Tom's chest, sending him stumbling backward. The entire showroom fell silent. Tom exhaled slowly, straightening his hoodie. He lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Graham. No anger. No frustration. Just a calm, knowing smile. And that was the moment no one in that room would ever forget. Tom stood still, absorbing the moment. The entire showroom had gone silent. No one expected the shove, let alone the punch. A young salesman by the front desk swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Graham. A few customers dressed in designer suits and expensive watches peeked over their shoulders, whispering. But no one stepped in. No one ever does. Tom rolled his shoulders, his breath steady. He wasn't angry. He had faced far worse. He thought back to when he was just a young actor in Hollywood, running from audition to audition. The doors that slammed in his face. The producers who smirked when he walked in, thinking he wasn't leading man material. The industry giants who told him, "You'll never make it. You're too short. You don't have the look." Yet here he was. He had proven them all wrong. But right now, he wasn't Tom Cruise, the Hollywood icon. He was just another guy in a hoodie being judged for how he looked. And that's what made it funny. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips, not from amusement but from recognition. He had seen this exact scenario play out before, just not with him as the target. Graham tilted his head. "Something funny, pal?" Tom wiped a hand over his mouth, shaking his head. "Nah, nothing. Just thinking about something." Graham scoffed, turning to one of his salesmen. "Do me a favor. Make sure security knows we have a loiterer." Tom exhaled slowly. There it was. Not just an insult, a dismissal. A way of saying you don't belong here. You're wasting my time. A customer in a tailored navy suit, probably some wealthy businessman, smirked as he overheard. "Yeah, buddy. Maybe try the used car lot down the street." Tom glanced at him, reading his body language. The slight smirk, the way he spoke just loud enough for others to hear. Another salesman chuckled under his breath. The energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer just one man underestimating him. It was everyone. This was what happened when people smelled weakness. They piled on. It was never about one person's arrogance. It was about how others fed off of it. Tom took a breath. His hands twitched slightly at his sides. Not from nerves but from restraint. Old instincts from years of being underestimated were surfacing. Back in the day, he would have fought to prove himself. He would have argued, raised his voice, tried to demand respect. But today he had nothing to prove. He could walk out right now. But he wasn't going to. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. Something was about to happen. Something that would make everyone in this room regret ever looking down on him. And they had no idea. Tom's fingers twitched at his sides, but his expression remained calm. He had been here before. Different setting, same judgment. Graham, the dealership manager, had already set the tone. He had labeled Tom as an outsider. And now the crowd followed suit. A teller at the customer service desk, a woman in her mid-40s with rectangular glasses and a stiff smile, leaned over the counter. She spoke just loud enough for the nearest customers to hear. Should we call security now or let him finish pretending? A couple standing nearby, a man in a tailored navy suit and a woman draped in a designer coat, chuckled. The man smirked. Maybe let him at least sit in one of the cars first. Might be the closest he'll ever get. Another salesman, who had been watching quietly, shook his head and muttered to a colleague, "Unbelievable. People really just walk in here thinking they can." His words trailed off, but his sneer finished the sentence. Tom breathed in slowly. He knew what was happening. The room had already decided what he was. Not based on his name. Not based on his achievements. Just his clothes. His quiet presence. The fact that he hadn't declared himself important. He wasn't mad. But he did feel something deeper, a familiar ache. For years, he had told himself that success had freed him from this. That once he made it, he'd never have to deal with people like this again. But that wasn't how the world worked. People don't judge you by what you've done. They judge you by what they see right now in this moment. And right now, they saw a nobody. "Sir." A sharp voice pulled him back to the present. The teller at the counter was addressing him directly now, her tone clipped and professional, but laced with condescension. She gestured at his hoodie, her smile tight. "Are you sure you're in the right place? We don't do test drives for just anyone." Tom tilted his head slightly, his lips parting as if he might answer. But before he could, Graham cut in again, stepping forward. "Actually," the manager said, his voice louder now, playing to the audience, "why don't we cut to the chase?" He turned to the wealthy couple, who had been watching in amusement. "What do you think? Should I let him test drive the Bugatti?" The man in the suit laughed outright. His wife covered her mouth, shaking her head. "Oh please," she scoffed. "I don't even think he has enough for a down payment on the rims." Laughter rippled through the showroom. Tom's jaw tensed slightly, but his face remained unreadable. Should he walk away? Wouldn't that be the easiest thing? He could just turn around, step outside, and disappear down the street. Let them believe whatever they wanted. It wouldn't affect his life. It wouldn't change who he was. And yet, something inside him refused to move. Not yet. Because this wasn't about proving himself to them. It was about proving something to himself. Graham smirked, taking Tom's silence as embarrassment. He took another step forward, voice dripping with mock concern. "You're awfully quiet now, buddy." He exaggerated a frown. "What's the matter?" Suddenly realizing you're in the wrong place. Another wave of soft laughter. Tom met his eyes unmoving. Graham crossed his arms. "Look, I'll make it simple. Show me proof of funds right now, right here, or get out." A hush fell over the room. Several bystanders leaned in, intrigued by how this would play out. Tom could hear whispers. "There's no way he can. Watch, he's gonna make an excuse. Ugh, people like him always waste our time." His hands remained still. His mind, however, raced. Should he just drop the act? Say his name? Watch their faces crumble? Or should he let this play out just a little longer? Because they had no idea. They had no idea who they were humiliating. And the moment of realization was going to be glorious. Tom stood there silent. The weight of the room pressed down on him. The whispers. The stares. The laughter that wasn't even subtle anymore. His hands twitched slightly at his sides. Not from anger. Not from frustration. But from something deeper, a quiet, familiar pain. For all his success, for all the years he had spent proving himself to the world, it still didn't matter in moments like this. Right now, in their eyes, he was just a joke. Graham, the dealership manager, wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, enjoying the spectacle. Well, he pressed, smirking. You gonna show me that proof of funds? Or should we just wrap this up? The woman at the counter sighed dramatically, looking at Tom with mock sympathy. You don't have to be embarrassed, she said, fake sweetness dripping in her tone. It's okay to dream. We all dream. Laughter again. A young salesman near the front chuckled under his breath and muttered, "This is brutal." Tom inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. But for the first time he wondered, was this a mistake? Should he have just left? He knew how this would end. Eventually someone would recognize him. The second his name was spoken aloud, the entire mood of the room would change. The smirks would disappear. The insults would die in their throats. And suddenly, just like that, he would be treated like royalty. But that wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't here to flex his name. He was here because he wanted to see people for who they really were. And right now, he was seeing them at their worst. Tom shifted slightly, his mind warring with itself. Would it really be so bad to just say it? To end this? He exhaled. He had nothing to prove. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, anything. And then, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A flicker of confusion among the employees at the front desk. The woman who had been mocking him suddenly froze, staring at her screen. A nearby banker, who had been laughing with a customer, glanced over her shoulder. Her smile faded. Even Graham, still reveling in his power, noticed the sudden change. He turned toward the desk, frowning. "What's going on?" he asked. The woman at the counter hesitated. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over her keyboard. She swallowed, blinking at the screen again. More whispers. Tom sensed it immediately. The energy in the room had shifted. The ones who had been mocking him, they were suddenly unsure. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at something else. A second later, one of the younger salesmen stumbled backward slightly, eyes widening. The customer in the navy suit, who had just moments ago been smirking, was no longer laughing. His expression tightened. Something had changed. And Tom wasn't the one who changed it. A moment of silence. Then the front door swung open. A presence entered the room. A slow murmur rippled through the staff. The laughter? Gone. The amusement? Vanished. Instead, a nervous, tense silence. Tom didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He could feel it. Whoever had just walked in, they carried weight. And they were here for him. Graham frowned, shifting his stance. He clearly didn't like being out of control. Can I help you?" he asked, his tone not nearly as smug anymore. A deep, steady voice responded. "I think the real question is..." Tom finally turned. And there he was. A man in a tailored black suit, standing in the center of the showroom. His presence commanding the space without even trying. Tom recognized him instantly. So did everyone else. The room had changed. And the game was about to flip. The air in the dealership had changed. Moments ago, Graham had complete control, laughing, mocking, humiliating. But now? Now everyone was quiet. The man in the tailored black suit took a slow step forward, his polished dress shoes tapping lightly against the marble floor. He moved with purpose but without urgency, radiating a quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. Tom stood still, watching. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The hero, whoever he was, had already taken over the room. Graham forced out a chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. Can I help you, sir?" The man's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't here to browse. "Interesting place you run," the man said, voice smooth but firm. There was no anger, just quiet control. "I couldn't help but notice how you treat potential customers." Graham blinked. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. "Oh, this." He let out a forced laugh, glancing around as if looking for support. Just a little misunderstanding, that's all. He turned toward Tom, waving dismissively. You know how it is. You work in sales long enough, you get a sense for who's serious and who's, well. He trailed off, smirking again, as if expecting the crowd to back him up. But this time no one did. The smirks had disappeared. The chuckles had died out. Instead, the customers who had laughed along earlier now exchanged uncertain glances. Some even took a step back, distancing themselves from Graham. Even the woman at the counter, who had mocked Tom just minutes ago, suddenly looked pale, her eyes darting toward the man in the suit. Graham noticed. His confidence faltered just slightly. The suited man took another step forward. Interesting, he said again. His voice was still calm, measured, but now there was something else beneath it. A quiet intensity. Graham swallowed. I was just following standard protocol, he said, suddenly on the defensive. Standard protocol? The man echoed. Graham nodded quickly. Yeah. You know how it is. We get people wandering in all the time, wasting our time, pretending they can afford things they can't. He forced another chuckle, trying to regain the upper hand. Besides, he added, if he really was serious about buying something, he should have just said so. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. It was subtle, but the tide had turned. The suited man tilted his head slightly. So that's your defense? Graham hesitated. Well, yeah. The man's lips twitched, just barely. Not a smile. Not yet. You're saying you judged him based on how he looked, and assumed he didn't belong here. Graham hesitated again, feeling the walls closing in. Listen, he tried again, his tone growing desperate. This guy came in here looking like he caught himself. For the first time, he realized what he was about to say couldn't be taken back. And that was when it hit him. The whispering staff. The nervous glances. The way the customers were no longer laughing with him, but instead watching him unravel. Graham's face paled slightly. Something was very, very wrong. He turned back to the man in the suit, his forced confidence completely gone now. Wait, he breathed. His throat went dry. His mind scrambled for any possible explanation. Who was this man? And why was everyone suddenly afraid of him? Graham's smirk had vanished. The confidence, the arrogance, all of it was gone. The suited man stood there, calm and unreadable, but his presence alone had turned the entire room against Graham. The manager's eyes darted around, desperate for support, but the same customers who had laughed with him earlier were now silent. Even his own employees, the salesmen, the tellers, the receptionists, were avoiding eye contact. No one was backing him up. He was alone. Graham cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. One last attempt to regain control. Look, I think we've all overreacted a little, he said, his voice wobbling slightly. I was just doing my job, making sure we focus on serious buyers. You know how it is. The suited man didn't blink. Serious buyers, he repeated, his voice steady. Graham nodded quickly, latching onto the excuse. Exactly. I mean, it's not personal. We can't let just anyone come in here and waste our time. A beat of silence. Then the man finally smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made you realize you'd already lost. The man turned slightly and gestured toward one of the tellers. Can you pull up the account? The teller visibly tensed. She had already seen the screen. She knew what was coming. But she obeyed, her fingers trembling slightly as she tapped a few keys. Then she turned the monitor. And Graham saw it. His face drained of color. He staggered back slightly, blinking. This can't be real, he muttered under his breath. But it was. Because the man standing in front of him was the owner of the entire dealership chain. The room was dead silent. Graham's breathing turned shallow. His hands twitched at his sides. All this time he had been mocking the very man who controlled his career. A slow realization crept over his face, his last shred of arrogance crumbling. The man's voice cut through the tension. I've seen a lot in my time, he said, his voice still eerily calm. But I've never seen a manager punch a potential customer in the chest, laugh in his face, and try to throw him out, without even realizing whose dealership he was standing in. Graham opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He had no defense. No excuse. Nothing. The suited man took a slow step forward. Do you know what happens next? Graham stumbled back again. Please, he whispered. I didn't mean to. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You're fired. The words slammed into Graham like a freight train. It was over. He knew it. Everyone knew it. And just like that, Graham Peterson, the once arrogant dealership manager, was nothing. The suited man turned to Tom. For the first time since stepping into the room, his expression softened. He gave Tom a small nod. A knowing nod. And then, without another word, he walked out. Tom stood there letting it sink in. The relief should have hit him instantly. The satisfaction of watching karma play out so perfectly. But instead, something deeper settled over him. Because this moment wasn't just about Graham. It was about every person who had underestimated him. Every time he had been told he wasn't good enough, wasn't the right fit, didn't belong. And today? Today he hadn't needed to argue. He hadn't needed to prove himself. He had just stood his ground. And the truth? It had done the rest. Tom took one last look at Graham, the man who had once looked untouchable and was now nothing more than a lesson. Then with a deep breath he turned and walked away. And as he stepped outside into the fresh air, one thing was certain. He would never see himself the same way again. The dealership showroom was silent. Graham hadn't moved. His face was still pale, his once confident stance completely gone. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like an avalanche. His career. Over. His power. Gone. The people who had once laughed with him. Avoiding his gaze. He let out a shaky breath, trying to grasp at anything, any excuse, any way to undo what had just happened. But there wasn't one. Because for the first time in his life he had no control. A security guard who had been standing near the entrance the entire time, finally stepped forward. His face was neutral, but his posture said everything. "Sir," the guard said, voice steady, "I think you should leave." Graham stiffened. "You can't be serious." The guard didn't blink. A long silence stretched between them. And then it sank in. Graham wasn't the one giving orders anymore. He was the one being escorted out. With shaky hands, he adjusted his suit jacket and gave a final, humiliating glance at the people who had once admired him. No one spoke. No one moved. And with that he turned and walked out the doors. The heavy glass door closed behind him, and just like that he was gone. Processing the moment, Tom stood there, watching it all unfold. He should have felt victorious. This was karma, wasn't it? The arrogant man had fallen. The one who mocked others had been humbled. And yet, there was no rush of satisfaction. No adrenaline-fueled triumph. Just quiet realization. Because it wasn't just about Graham. This moment, this entire experience, had pulled something out of him he hadn't expected. It brought back every memory of being doubted. Every time someone had sized him up and decided he wasn't enough. And today? He hadn't had to fight. He hadn't had to scream for respect. Truth had done all the work for him. Tom ran a hand down his hoodie, feeling the worn fabric between his fingers. The same hoodie that had made them think he was a nobody. The same hoodie that had hidden the fact that he was, well, him. He exhaled slowly. So that's how the world worked, huh? The weight of the moment still settled on his shoulders when he felt a presence next to him. The quiet conversation. The suited man, the owner of the dealership chain, hadn't left. He stood beside Tom, hands in his pockets, his expression calm but unreadable. Tom glanced at him. "You knew, didn't you?" Tom asked, his voice quieter now. The man gave a small, knowing smile. "Not at first." Tom let out a breath, shaking his head. "I could have stopped that from happening at any time." "You could have," the man agreed. A moment of silence. Then Tom finally asked, "Why did you step in?" The man took a slow breath. "Because people like him need to be reminded that respect isn't about appearances." Tom studied him for a moment. There was something deeper in his tone. This wasn't just about what had happened today. This man, he'd been there before too. First time being underestimated, the man asked, his voice light but with a knowing edge. Tom let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Not even close." The man smiled faintly. "Then you already know. You don't always need to prove yourself. People's judgment of you isn't your problem. It's theirs." Tom looked down for a moment, processing the words. The suited man clapped him on the shoulder. A small but meaningful gesture. Then with a final nod, he turned and walked away. Tom stood there, alone in the now quiet dealership. He had come in for a car, but he was leaving with something else entirely. Tom stood outside the dealership, his hands in his hoodie pockets, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The glass doors behind him reflected his image. The same worn-out hoodie, the same faded jeans, the same scuffed sneakers. The same clothes that had made everyone in that showroom think he was nobody. He let out a slow breath. People see what they want to see. They look at the surface, at appearances, at labels, at first impressions, and they decide your worth before you even open your mouth. It wasn't new to him. Not in Hollywood. Not in life. But today had been different. Because for once he hadn't fought back. He hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to prove himself. He had just let the truth play out. And in the end, that had been enough. A breeze passed through, ruffling his hoodie slightly. The same hoodie he had worn through a dozen movie sets, across different countries, on and off red carpets. And yet, all it had taken was one glance for them to decide he was less. He smirked to himself. Funny how that works. His fingers brushed against the keys in his pocket, the keys to the very car they said he could never afford. He could walk back inside and buy it. He could buy every car in that showroom just to prove a point. But he didn't need to. Because winning isn't about proving others wrong. It's about knowing who you are. Even when no one else does. Tom exhaled and turned away from the dealership, stepping into the street. Then without looking back he walked away. Because the truth was he had already won. Final lesson in CTA integration. In life, people will judge you. They'll look at your clothes, your background, your job, your status, and they'll think they know you. But what they think doesn't define you. What defines you is who you are when no one believes in you. So let them underestimate you. Because when the time is right, the truth will always speak louder than words. If this story moved you, remember this. Your worth isn't in how others see you. It's in how you see yourself. And that is something no one can take away.